This lakefront property is now under HOA authority. You have 30 days to vacate or we'll make you. That was the message Patricia Walsh, the neighborhood's self-proclaimed queen bee, delivered after I had the audacity to ban her son and his buddies from throwing wild parties at my late brother's lake cabin. She stood smugly on my porch, waving official-looking documents with a practiced smile, all while her darling son had just wrecked the memorial garden I maintained for 2 decades in my brother's honor. When I asked them to leave, she didn't hesitate to call the police, accusing me of illegally restricting public access to what she claimed was HOA common ground. Patricia acted like she held all the cards, like nothing could touch her, but what she didn't realize was that karma was already loading its first punch. That Saturday morning, I pulled into the gravel driveway of the cabin, just looking for some calm after a tough work week. Instead, I stepped into chaos. The lavender gardenia, carefully planted and lovingly tended by my brother David for 20 years, was in ruins. Every single bloom was trampled into the mud. Solar lights were broken, their shards scattered like debris after a storm, and most heartbreaking of all, the hand-carved stone bird my brother made before cancer claimed him. It lay shattered in 3 pieces near the lakeshore. My first thought was of the old security camera David had installed beneath the eave as he'd been worried about break-ins during his illness. I rushed inside, powered up his dusty desktop, and pulled up the footage from the previous night. What I saw made my blood run cold. Around 8 p.m., a group of 5 young adults had set up what looked like a full-blown party on the lakeside grass. Massive speakers, beer coolers, loud music, and not an ounce of respect for anyone else's space. Leading the chaos was a smug, bleach-haired kid who clearly thought he was in charge. The footage showed me walking over around 9:30. I could hear myself politely asking them to lower the volume. I pointed to the cabin and explained that the land was private and asked them to clean up when they were done. The response from the bleach-haired punk is something I'll never forget. "Listen, old man, this is HOA common land. I've got every right to be here. If you want quiet, go back to your house." At the time, I'd walked away, assuming they were just kids being inconsiderate. But what the camera revealed next made my stomach churn. After I'd gone inside, the ringleader looked directly into the camera, smirked, and told his friends, "Watch this, guys." Time to teach the old man a lesson. Then, deliberately, he stomped into the lavender garden and began destroying it flower by flower while the others laughed and egged him on. This wasn't immaturity, it was intentional vandalism, a message. But something in the background caught my eye and made me rewind the footage. There, partially hidden among the trees about 50 yards away, was a black Mercedes sedan. Its license plate matched the high-end format used in our county. Curious, I went next door to speak with Henry, an elderly neighbor who had lived here for decades. He was tending his vegetable garden when I approached. I showed him the photos of the destruction, and his face fell. "I've been warning people about Patricia Walsh for years," he said, shaking his head. "She's been tightening her grip on the HOA since becoming president. Thinks the lake belongs to her now." I asked who Patricia Walsh was, and Henry's expression darkened. "She's the one running the HOA and that bleach-haired brat stirring up trouble? That's her son, Jack." Chip off the old block. When I showed him the screenshot of the Mercedes, he confirmed it without hesitation. "That's Patricia's car, all right. She drives it everywhere. He wants everyone to know how important she is. But why would she be hiding out in the trees last night while her son destroyed your garden?" The silence that followed said everything. This wasn't a case of reckless teenagers. This was premeditated, planned. I thanked Henry and returned to the cabin, my thoughts racing. I sat on the porch steps, holding a letter I'd written to David long ago but never sent. In it, I had poured out how much this place meant to me, how it was my last real connection to him. Now, with everything around me in ruins, it felt like someone was trying to wipe out David's memory completely. The footage made it clear, Jack's actions weren't random. They were deliberate and worse, supervised by his mother, the HOA president. But why? Why would Patricia Walsh, a woman I had never even met, go to such cruel lengths to destroy something so personal? What was she trying to achieve with this calculated act? And more importantly, what did she plan to do next? The next morning, I printed screenshots from the footage and arranged them into a detailed timeline. As a data analyst, I knew that solid evidence mattered more than emotional accusations. With Henry's help, I found Patricia Walsh's address and drove there. Her home was as ostentatious as expected, an imposing two-story structure with picture-perfect landscaping. The same black Mercedes from the footage sat in her circular driveway, confirming what I already knew. When she answered the door, Patricia was dressed in an expensive silk blouse, her expression cool and mildly irritated, as if my presence was a disturbance to her carefully curated day. She was probably in her early 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the calm arrogance of someone used to always getting her way. I introduced myself as David's brother and explained that I now owned the lake cabin. Her eyes flickered just a little, but she kept her mask of composure firmly in place. "Oh yes," she said smoothly. "The lake cabin. I'm so sorry for your loss." "David was such a wonderful man," Patricia said, though her voice lacked sincerity. Her words felt mechanical, like she'd rehearsed them for moments like this. I handed her the photos of the ruined garden and showed her the security footage capturing Jack's intentional destruction, hoping naively for an apology or at least an offer to make amends. Instead, she glanced at the evidence with the detached curiosity of someone flipping through a stranger's vacation album. "I understand you're upset," she said coolly, "but Jack is just a young man. They make mistakes. Perhaps you're reading too much into what was probably just a harmless prank." Her tone dripped with condescension, as if she were speaking to a child incapable of grasping adult logic. I calmly pointed out that this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was clearly recorded. Deliberate vandalism. The video captured Jack saying it was meant as retaliation. That's when her entire demeanor shifted. She motioned toward a wall adorned with framed certificates and plaques, each one flaunting her role and achievements in the HOA. "You need to understand how things work here," she said, her voice now sharp and commanding. "I've been elected HOA president for 3 consecutive years. No one knows these rules better than I do. I strongly suggest you familiarize yourself with them before making baseless accusations against respected members of this community." Then came the veiled threat, one that would stay with me long after I left. Looking me straight in the eye, she added, "If you're finding it difficult to align with our community standards, maybe this isn't the right place for you. Some people find they're happier living somewhere that better suits their expectations." She wore a smile as she said it, but the meaning was unmistakable. Either fall in line or prepare for consequences. When I questioned why her car was parked at the scene during the incident, she waved it off with practiced ease. "I drive around the neighborhood often. It's part of my role." "You're probably mistaken about what you think you saw." It was clear I wasn't going to get anywhere with her directly, so I decided on a different course. That afternoon, I crafted a handmade wooden sign. On it, I carefully carved the words, "Private property, please respect." I coated it with weatherproof sealant and installed it at the lake's edge, right where Jack and his friends had trashed everything. The sign looked professional and tasteful, nothing aggressive, just a clear marker of ownership and boundaries. For the first time in days, I felt a small sense of control. It was a step toward re-establishing some order, but that feeling didn't last. The next morning, I stepped outside to find the sign utterly destroyed. Not simply knocked over or removed, it ripped from its base and tossed into the lake, now bobbing in the water like discarded junk. The ground was torn up with tire tracks and muddy boot prints, a clear sign that this was no accident. Someone had deliberately vandalized it. Wading into the shallow water, I pulled out the broken pieces, one by one, fury rising with each soggy board. But the real punch came when I checked the mailbox. Inside was an official-looking envelope bearing the logo of the hose management company. The contents made my blood boil. It was a formal violation notice. I was being fined $500 for installing unauthorized signage without prior HOA approval and alleged violation of Section 12.c, Lakefront Scenic Harmony. I had to reread the letter multiple times, struggling to believe what I was seeing. They were penalizing me for posting a simple sign on what I believed to be my own property. Henry noticed me standing at the mailbox. Still stunned, he wandered over, saw the envelope in my hand, and sighed knowingly. "Section 12.c, huh?" he muttered. "Knew that one would come back to bite someone. I warned people when she pushed that amendment through 2 years ago. It's vague on purpose. It gives her way too much control over anything near the lake." He explained that Section 12.c was Patricia's personal pet project. The rule supposedly protected the lakefront's scenic harmony, but was so loosely written it could be twisted to justify just about anything. Henry had been one of only 3 people to vote against it, but by then Patricia had enough influence to get it passed without resistance. That evening, I sat down with the full HOA rulebook, all 47 pages, and began reading. I needed to understand what I was up against. Section 12.c was as deliberately murky as Henry said. It mentioned preserving aesthetic uniformity and ensuring community access to natural scenic resources, but never defined what those terms actually meant. The wording was broad, ambiguous, and ripe for exploitation. The more I read, the more I realized Patricia wasn't just hiding behind the rules as she had crafted them. She knew this system inside out, and she was weaponizing the knowledge to push me out. Type trap if you believe Patricia had orchestrated this from the very beginning. I had just 25 days to pay the $500 fine or face what the HOA called additional legal consequences. The language was vague, but the threat behind it wasn't. The pressure was building fast, and I knew I had to fully understand the situation before Patricia unleashed whatever next step she had planned. So I went to the only place I thought might hold answers, the cabin's storage room, where David had left behind boxes of old documents. As I sifted through stacks of paperwork spanning decades, the thumping of bass from outside grew louder. Another party was starting by the lake, bigger and bolder than the last. I glanced through the cabin window and saw Jack and his crew setting up an even larger sound system than before. They'd brought camping chairs, a portable fire pit, and more alcohol than most bars keep in stock. What caught my eye wasn't the noise or the gear. It was a banner they had hung between 2 trees. It read, "Still here, deal with it." This wasn't just another party. It was a declaration, a mockery of my efforts to reclaim control. They knew I couldn't stop them, and they were reveling in that fact. Around midnight, as I buried myself in legal documents and property records, a beer bottle came crashing through the front window of the cabin. Shards of glass exploded across the floor. Outside, laughter and cheering rang out. Attached to the bottle was a note scrawled in thick black marker, "24 days left, old man. We'll keep partying here till you're gone." Jack. I stood there amid broken glass, holding that note, and I finally understood. This wasn't just about property. It was harassment, coordinated, persistent, and meant to drive me out. But instead of calling the police or storming outside, I chose a different response. I channeled my anger into something more useful: research. I spent the rest of the night meticulously combing through David's files. Most of it was Britannia insurance forms, tax records, maintenance receipts. But then, deep inside a worn folder labeled "Original Property Purchase," I found something that made my heart stop. It was an old surveyor's map dated 1987. The document showed the original boundaries from when David's grandfather had first bought the land from the state. And what it revealed turned everything upside down. According to the survey, the area everyone believed was public HOA common space, including the exact spot where Jack had hosted his chaotic party, was in fact private land, my family's land. But it didn't stop there. The map showed that my family didn't just own the shoreline, it included the entire lake itself, along with a substantial portion of the surrounding property. We were talking about highly desirable real estate, likely worth millions today, and somehow, over time, the community had either forgotten or been led to believe that it belonged to the HOA. I spread that decades-old map across the kitchen table beside a current HOA community layout. The contrast was shocking. The updated HOA map depicted the lake and its surrounding area as a communal recreational zone. But the 1987 survey clearly showed private ownership extending from the waterline up to 200 feet inland, wrapping around the lake's perimeter. Jack hadn't just been trespassing on a strip of land, he'd been throwing parties on land that legally belonged to my family. And Patricia, his mother and the HOA president, had been enabling this for years. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Patricia Walsh had unrestricted access to the community's records and legal archives. There was no doubt in my mind, She knew the truth. She had known all along that this land was private and still chose to ignore it. That meant every one of her actions wasn't just defensive. They were calculated. She hadn't dismissed my complaints to shield her son from consequences. She was protecting herself from liability, from scandal, and potentially from a legal nightmare that might reveal years of negligence, or worse, fraud. I thought back to the way she had stood on her doorstep, so composed, so sure of herself. The smirk behind her threats, the casual dismissal of my concerns. She had played her role with practiced confidence, counting on me to be too confused or intimidated to fight back. But what she didn't count on was how far I'd go to defend my brother's memory or how good I was at piecing together a problem. The old survey was officially dated, signed by a licensed surveyor, and filed with the county recorder's office. There was no uncertainty, no gray area. The documents were airtight. As I sat at David's old desk, staring out over the lake I now knew belonged to our family, a wave of emotion washed over me. I felt a mixture of anger and something deeper, something more personal. The years of confusion, the harassment, the threats, it all made my blood boil. But at the same time, I felt more connected to David than I had in a long while. This land hadn't just been a weekend retreat for him. It was an inheritance, a part of our family's story going back generations. The lavender garden Jack had destroyed wasn't just decorative landscaping. It was part of the legacy our grandfather started when he first bought this land from the state. I carefully photographed every page of the survey mappa, capturing the surveyor's signature, official seals, and county filing marks in high resolution. Then I drafted an email addressed to Patricia Walsh and copied every member of the HOA board. The subject line was clear and assertive: urgent, property boundary clarification, immediate cessation of trespassing required. In the message, I explained my discovery of the original property lines and demanded that all HOA activities cease on what was now confirmed as privately owned land. I included the photographs of the map and formally requested a meeting with the board to address the implications. But as I hovered over the send button, I paused. Patricia wasn't just some disorganized home manager. She was a manipulator who thrived on control and knew how to use her authority like a weapon. Sending her the full truth up front might give her time to twist it, stall, or retaliate. I needed a more tactical approach, so I deleted the formal email. Instead, I wrote something brief and pointed. Patricia, I found something interesting in my brother's old files. We should talk. No attachments, no legal terms, just a quiet signal that I was on to her. Want to guess how Patricia reacted when she realized I'd uncovered the truth? Drop your predictions in the comments. She didn't respond. Instead, 2 hours after I sent that message, I heard sirens echoing down the lake road. I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, cautiously optimistic for the first time in days, when the patrol car rolled in. I had no idea Patricia had just dialed 911 and told dispatch that she needed to report a hostile neighbor as someone allegedly making threats and unlawfully restricting access to community land. Officer Rodriguez stepped out of the cruiser, a calm, professional-looking man in his late 40s, with the quiet patience of someone who had seen more than his share of HOA drama. I welcomed him to the porch and immediately pulled out the survey documents. I explained what I had uncovered at the lakefront property, thought to be common ground, had actually been in my family for decades. He listened intently, studying the papers and nodding as I walked him through the details. "This looks like a legitimate survey," he said. "If it's accurate, then you're absolutely right about these boundaries." Just as things were starting to make sense, Patricia made her entrance. She didn't just stroll over, she made a production of it. She arrived with a luxury leather briefcase slung over one arm and Jack trailing smugly behind her, wearing an expression that made my fists itch. Patricia looked perfectly composed, like she'd been rehearsing for this showdown. She greeted Officer Rodriguez with a warm familiarity that suggested they'd met before, probably at neighborhood events she hosted to stay in the good graces of local officials. "Officer Rodriguez," she said in syrupy tones, "thank you so much for coming. I'm terribly sorry you had to be dragged into this, but we seem to have a situation involving a new resident who doesn't yet understand our community's expectations." The way she emphasized new resident made it sound like a criminal accusation. She unclasped her briefcase and pulled out a thick HOA binder, stabbed and color-coded like a courtroom exhibit. It was clear she had prepared for this confrontation well in advance. Flipping it open to a bookmarked page, she launched into her argument. "Officer Rodriguez, I'd like to bring your attention to Section 12.c of our HOA covenants," she said, her tone shifting into something resembling a legal deposition. "This section covers lakefront scenic harmony, and in the case of property disputes, it allows the HOA the right to purchase said properties at fair market value to protect community interests." She looked directly at me, her smile sharpening as she handed the officer a manila envelope. "Fair market value," she continued, "will be determined by an independent appraisal commissioned by the board." Her words hit like a slap. Patricia wasn't just trying to find me or harass me anymore. She was claiming the authority to force the sale of my family's land, whether I agreed to it or not. She'd already hired an appraiser. She wasn't preparing to discuss my discovery. She was preparing to erase it. Patricia stood firm on her supposed authority, citing the community covenants as justification. According to her, the HOA had the right to buy the lakefront for $75,000. And they intended to finalize the purchase within 30 days to settle the dispute and preserve ongoing public access to what she called shared recreational facilities. Officer Rodriguez glanced between the paperwork Patricia handed him and the historic survey map I'd presented. I could see the tension in his expression as he tried to make sense of a deeply tangled legal situation and unsure what was actually enforceable law and what was just an overreach wrapped in red tape. The document Patricia brought did look official. It had the polished letterhead, a notarized signature, and all the trappings of legitimacy. But I knew enough about property valuation to spot a scam when I saw one. $75,000 for a lakefront property of this caliber was absurd. Not just low, it was practically theft masquerading as a generous offer. Patricia maintained her polished tone, trying to project calm authority, as if she were the only rational adult in the conversation. "We're not looking to be unreasonable," she said smoothly. "Our goal is to preserve the shared values that make this community special. The lakefront has been a public gathering place for over 15 years. We can't just let a single person cut everyone else off from it." She sounded convincing or reasonable, even, but I could see through it. Her words were carefully chosen, her tone disarming, but the real purpose was clear: to manipulate perception and justify stealing control over land that didn't belong to her. As I listened, I saw the bigger picture taking shape. This wasn't a last-minute scramble to defend HOA rights. It was a calculated strategy that Patricia had likely set in motion the moment she caught wind of my claim. That bogus appraisal, it hadn't been whipped up on short notice. She'd known about the true property boundaries for a willy long before I ever did. She was ready for this confrontation. She'd probably even rehearsed it. Everything about her confidence made sense now. When she shrugged off my concerns about Jack's vandalism, it wasn't negligence. It was because she never expected me to stay long enough to do anything about it. The clause she kept referencing, a Section 12.3 CA, was more than just a rule. It was a weapon she'd helped craft to push out anyone who threatened her control. This wasn't about scenic harmony or shared amenities. This was about keeping her grip on the crown jewel of the neighborhood, the lakefront, and I had become an obstacle in her path. Officer Rodriguez was stuck in the middle. He pulled between conflicting paperwork and legal authority on both sides. "This is clearly a complex civil dispute," he finally said. "At this point, I strongly recommend both parties seek legal counsel to determine next steps." It was the kind of safe, non-committal response that protected him from taking a side in a mess that was far beyond a routine call. As the officer started preparing to leave, Patricia delivered the blow she had been holding in reserve. She turned to me, her expression cool and composed. "I want to be very clear," she said. "You have 30 days to consider what we believe is a very reasonable offer. This is the simplest solution for you and for everyone else. Declining it could mean a much more expensive, drawn-out process." Her words were dipped in honey but sharp as razors. The message was unmistakable: "Take our money or we'll drag you through legal hell until you give up." Once the cruiser pulled away, Patricia and Jack lingered for a moment. Jack, ever the provocateur, couldn't resist tossing one last insult over his shoulder. "Better unplug that fancy camera, old man. Won't be your cabin much longer anyway." Patricia gently placed a hand on his arm, probably trying to appear more composed, but the satisfaction on her face was obvious. She thought she had won. She believed she backed me into a corner, forcing me to sell off a piece of my family's legacy for pennies on the dollar. I stood on the porch, the same spot where David and I once shared beers after long hikes, and watched them walk away. Their smug smiles might as well have been victory banners waving in the breeze. But that's when something clicked. In her eagerness to show off her control, Patricia had tipped her hand. She'd revealed just how long this had been brewing, how much of her strategy had been built on hiding facts I'd only just uncovered. The only question now was whether I had what it took to fight back against someone who had spent years tightening her grip on this community. Want me to keep pushing back? Type fight. Think I should take the money and walk away? Type give up. Over the next 2 days, I called every real estate attorney I could find. I explained the situation again and again, and almost every conversation ended the same way. They all told me the same thing: fighting back wouldn't be cheap. The legal battle I'd need to wage to block the forced purchase could cost anywhere from $15,000 to $25,000, and even then, there was no guarantee I'd win. My job as a data analyst paid decently, but I didn't have that kind of cash just sitting around, not for legal warfare, and the cruel irony didn't escape me. I was being cornered into selling high-value land, worth hundreds of thousands and maybe more for a pittance, simply because I couldn't afford the fight it would take to keep what was already mine. By the third night, I found myself sitting beside the lake, a glass of David's old whiskey in hand, staring at the water as doubts crept in. Patricia's offer $75,000 felt more tempting than I wanted to admit. It wouldn't make me whole, not by a long shot, but it would end the stress, the threats, the feeling of being cornered. I pulled out the letter I'd written to David months earlier but never mailed. For the first time since his funeral, I considered adding one final line. "I'm sorry, brother, I couldn't protect the land you loved." My fingers drifted toward the lighter I'd brought out, ready to burn the note and move on, but before the flame caught, I heard my name being called from the shoreline. It was Henry. He trudged through the darkness with a thermos in hand, his expression gentle, like a father who knew exactly when to speak and when to just sit quietly. "I saw you out here, looking like you'd lost the fight," he said as he took a seat beside me. "Figured you could use some company." Henry, my elderly neighbor, wasn't just dropping by to check in. He brought stories of his own battles with Patricia Walsh. 2 years ago, she tried to find me over my vegetable garden, he said. Claimed it violated aesthetic uniformity. I beat her on that, but she made sure I paid in other ways. That's when he told me he started documenting everything she did, every suspicious budget item, every shady board vote, every so-called improvement that seemed to benefit no one but her. He leaned in and lowered his voice. "You know that fancy stone wall she built behind her house? The one that looks like it belongs in a vineyard in Napa?" I nodded. It was impressive, natural stone, professional workmanship, pristine finish. She claimed it was funded through the whole landscaping budget, said it was part of a community beautification effort. I raised an eyebrow. "But it's on her private lot, right?" "Exactly. Nobody else gets anything from it, just her." Something about that stuck with me. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces started moving in my mind. Patricia had been expanding her influence for years, pushing vague policies like Section 12.c, initiating costly community projects. Yet the only real beneficiary seemed to be her. And that wall? It had to have cost a fortune. "Henry," I asked, "do you have any idea what she spent on it?" He shook his head. "But you do have the right to find out. As a homeowner, you can formally request the HOA's financial records. It's in the bylaws. They can't deny you." The next morning, Jack and his friends came back, at this time throwing what they dubbed my farewell party. They had a professionally printed banner stretched between 2 trees that read, "Goodbye, Marcus, thanks for the lake." Music blasted loud enough to rattle windows, and they popped open beer cans with theatrical flair. But this time, I didn't get angry. I didn't retreat. Instead, I understood. This wasn't just immaturity or cruelty, it was a campaign, a coordinated effort to wear me down psychologically. They wanted me to break, to accept Patricia's lowball offer just to make it all stop. But thanks to Henry, I finally saw the entire board, not just the pieces. That afternoon, I sat at David's desk and began drafting a formal records request. Using precise legal language, I cited my rights as a property owner to access the HOA's financial documents. I asked for complete and itemized records of all community beautification spending from the past 3 years, every invoice, every contractor, every check written. I also demanded any and all appraisals, surveys, and legal opinions relating to lakefront property management. If Patricia had spent home money for personal gain, the paper trail would be there. That evening, Henry stopped by again to help me review the request. He read it line by line, his face slowly breaking into a grin. "This is solid," he said. "Clean, thorough, and professional. If she tries to dodge this, she's exposing herself to even more liability." We copied every member of the HOA board and included a calm but firm note. I was conducting due diligence before making any decision on the proposed property sale. I didn't accuse Patricia of wrongdoing, not directly, but I made it unmistakably clear that I was watching the books closely. The next morning, I submitted the formal request to the HOA's management company. For the first time since this ordeal began, I wasn't just reacting. I wasn't being pushed. I was taking initiative. I was fighting back with precision, not emotion. David always said problems were just puzzles waiting to be solved, and that the worst thing you could do was panic before finding all the pieces. I'd been letting Patricia's manipulation cloud my thinking, but now, I was back in my element, analyzing, investigating, following trails. That night, I didn't pour a glass of whiskey. I brewed a cup of coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the stars flicker over the lake. Whatever the financial records revealed, I was finally shifting the momentum. Either Patricia's spending was legitimate, or she had something to hide. And I was ready to find out which. One way or another, I was finally closing in on the truth. I needed to decide my next move. The only question now was whether Patricia would cooperate, or whether she'd keep trying to bury whatever secrets those financial records held. Spoiler alert. She chose the latter. Patricia Walsh tried every stalling tactic imaginable to delay handing over the documents I had legally requested. First, she claimed the records had to be redacted for privacy compliance. Then she said some were stored off-site with an accounting firm and might take several weeks to retrieve. Finally, she insisted I'd need to review them in person, under the supervision of the HOA's attorney, by appointment only. But I wasn't new to research and regulatory procedures. I knew the law. As a property owner, I had a legal right to examine those records within a reasonable time. No red tape, no stall tactics, just access. While I waited, Patricia escalated her assault, not through direct confrontation, but via a paper trail of absurdity. Each day, a new violation notice showed up in my mailbox, every single one more ludicrous than the last. It wasn't harassment anymore, it was performance art designed to make me snap. Day 1, I was fined $100 because my kayak was the wrong shade of blue, which apparently created visual discord with the natural lake environment. Day 2, a $75 violation for positioning my patio furniture at a non-compliant angle, inconsistent with the community's lakefront seating orientation guidelines. Day 3, I was fined $50 for hanging a towel on my porch railing the wrong way. The notice cited textile display standards, and included a 3-paragraph explanation on how to properly hang towels in aesthetic harmony with nature. I had to read that one 3 times before I was sure I hadn't lost my mind, but it all made sense when I opened violation 4. The notice stated that I had now committed more than 3 violations within a single week, which, under Section 12.c, constituted chronic non-compliance. That status, the notice continued, allowed the HOA to accelerate the property acquisition timeline. Instead of 30 days, Patricia was now giving me 7. That's when it hit me. Patricia wasn't just bombarding me with these fines to wear me down, as she was manufacturing a paper trail, one that would portray me as a chronic rule breaker, a justification for stripping me of my land under the very regulations she'd written herself. It was legal theater. And it was brilliant. Ruthless, but brilliant. I stared at the notice in my kitchen, the paper shaking in my hand. I finally understood what I was dealing with. Patricia wasn't improvising. She had built this machine to crush people like me. Every fine, Every clause, every regulation, it was all part of a framework designed to force compliance or push people out. In desperation, I called Henry. "She's not just trying to buy my land," I said. "She's building a legal case to take it from me." Henry was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Marcus, a broken bar. I think I might have something that can help you. Can you come over tonight?" When I arrived, Henry led me into a small home office that looked like it belonged to a retired detective, not a retired engineer. Cabinets lined the walls, binders sat neatly labeled on every shelf, and his desk was covered in notes, folders, and documents sorted with military precision. "I've been keeping records on Patricia for the past 2 years," he said, pulling out a stack of folders. "Ever since she came after my garden, I knew someone would need proof of her abuse one day." He handed me a folder marked financial irregularities. What I found inside changed everything. There were emails, photographs, handwritten notes, copies of checks. Henry had been conducting his own quiet investigation, and it painted a damning portrait. The wall surrounding Patricia's property, the one she claimed was a community beautification project, according to HOA records, it had cost $47,000 and had been paid to a company called Greenscape Landscaping. Henry had looked up Greenscape's business registration. It was listed under Patricia Walsh's home address. We spent the next 3 hours combing through Henry's evidence. What emerged was a clear pattern of self-dealing and embezzlement. Patricia had been using her position as HOA president to funnel thousands of dollars in community funds into personal upgrades for her property, always under the convenient label of neighborhood improvement. The wall was just the most obvious example. There were payments for vague landscaping consultations, drainage improvements, and aesthetic renovations that all appeared to benefit only her house. The same expenses she refused to explain in meetings were now sitting in Henry's records, receipts, checks, and vendor info, all pointing back to her. She wasn't just a control freak, she was a thief, and now I had proof. For the first time in weeks, I felt the tide shift. Patricia had played her game well. She had built her little empire with rules and bureaucracy and fear. But she had forgotten one crucial truth. Even the most carefully constructed paper empire burns fast once someone strikes a match. And I was holding the matchbook, armed with Henry's records. I finally had the context I needed when the home management company reluctantly turned over the financial documents 2 days later. Drawing on my skills as a data analyst, I built a comprehensive spreadsheet to track every payment made to Greenscape Landscaping and any related contractors over the past 3 years. The total was staggering, of $47,000 in community funds, funneled into companies that were, in effect, Patricia Walsh's personal piggy banks. Every cent had been used to improve her private property. Not $1 had benefited the rest of the neighborhood. The smoking gun, a series of invoices totaling $12,000. Listed as expenses for lakefront shoreline enhancement and erosion control. According to the paperwork, this was meant to beautify and preserve the entire community's access to the lake. But when Henry and I walked the entire lake perimeter every inch, we found nothing. No new riprap, no planted grasses, no erosion prevention work, not even a single stone out of place. The work had never been done. The invoices were fakes. The money was gone. That night, I stayed up in the cabin documenting everything. I created a detailed report that included photographs of Patricia's private stone wall, side-by-side comparisons of the fabricated invoices and actual lakefront conditions, business registration documents linking Greenscape Landscaping to Patricia's home address, a financial breakdown proving how HOA funds were systematically siphoned into her personal property projects. It wasn't just evidence, it was a case. Sitting there in the glow of my laptop, I finally grasped the full picture. This wasn't just about enforcing vague HOA rules or silencing noise complaints. Patricia was a corrupt official, and she was trying to seize my land not just for control but to cover up her crimes. That lowball $75,000 purchase offer, it wasn't just strategic, it was a preemptive strike. If I accepted it, I'd disappear, and so would the only person who had uncovered her embezzlement. I called Henry immediately. "Marcus," he said after hearing everything, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been waiting 2 years for this. I've always known she was dirty, but I could never prove it. Now we've got her. Cold." We both agreed, It was time to go public. Patricia had relied on keeping her enemies isolated, one at a time. But she couldn't manipulate an entire room of homeowners when the evidence was this clear. We were going to put her crimes in front of the very people she had been stealing from. Henry helped me draft a letter requesting an emergency home meeting to address urgent financial matters affecting property values and community trust. We didn't mention the embezzlement outright, but we worded it carefully enough to ensure Patricia would understand the underlying threat. The message worked. 42 of the neighborhood's 47 homeowners showed up at the community center that Wednesday evening. I had never seen so many of my neighbors in one room. The air was thick with curiosity, tension, and whispers. People were clearly expecting some kind of financial crisis, but they didn't yet know the scope of it. Patricia opened the meeting with her usual calm, rehearsed demeanor, playing the part of the composed, seasoned president. "Before we move to the financial agenda Marcus requested," she said with a practiced smile, "I'd like to share some good news. The HOA has resolved the recent property dispute. We've agreed to purchase the lakefront parcel for $75,000, ensuring continued access for all residents." A few scattered nods rippled through the crowd. Patricia's smile widened as she thought she'd won. She believed she had diffused whatever I had planned by framing it as a victory for the community. Then she made a mistake. She handed me the floor. I stood, walked to the front of the room, and connected my laptop to the projector. The screen flickered to life. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began. "I need to show you something important." The first slide played, security camera footage of Jack or Patricia Soda destroying the lavender garden my brother had planted years ago. The video was crystal clear. Jack could be seen smashing the stone borders, ripping up flowers, laughing with his friends. And then came the audio. "Stupid old man, maybe this'll finally make him leave." Gasps echoed through the room. Faces turned toward Patricia, and suddenly her confident posture faltered. "This," I said, "wasn't just vandalism, it was intimidation. A coordinated attempt to push me off my own land. And that's only the beginning." I clicked to the next slide, and the real presentation began. The room had already fallen into stunned silence by the time I advanced to the second slide. The original 1987 survey map. It clearly showed that the lakefront land in question belonged to my family and not the HOA. "Jack wasn't just being reckless," I said, my voice steady. "He was trespassing." And Patricia, in her role as HOA president, allowed it, encouraged it. The third slide showed a side-by-side comparison of the HOA's current property map versus the original survey. The difference was undeniable. The community had been operating under false assumptions for years. A wave of uneasy murmurs rippled across the crowd. Eyes darted around the room. People were beginning to realize just how deeply they'd been misled. "Now," I continued, clicking to the next slide, "let's talk about where your money went." A few nervous chuckles. Then I asked, "How many of you are familiar with greenscape landscaping?" A few tentative hands went up. "Well, in the last 3 years, Greenscape has received over $47,000 in HOA funds for a community improvements." The next slide popped to pay an image of Patricia's lavish stone wall. "This," I said, "is where the money went." Gasps, angry whispers, heads turned. Every single dollar was spent on upgrades to Patricia's private property. Not a single community area was improved. Patricia suddenly stood, her face flushed with a mix of panic and fury. "This is a personal attack," she shouted. "He's trying to tear our community apart just because he doesn't want to follow the rules." I stayed calm. "Let's take a look at this." Then, I brought up the business registration form for Greenscape Landscaping listing Patricia's home address. "She's not just spending your money, she's paying herself with it." The final slide appeared. Fake invoices for $12,000 supposedly used for shoreline improvements that never happened. "This money," I said, "was supposed to benefit the entire neighborhood." But when Henry and I walked the entire lakefront, there was no evidence of any work. "These invoices are fake. The money is gone." From the back of the room, Henry stood and raised his folder. "I have additional documentation," he announced. "I've been tracking Patricia's financial activities for 2 years. This isn't just about Marcus. She's been using your dues to line her own pockets, and she tried to take his land to cover it up." As Henry began listing transaction after transaction, the crowd turned fully against her. People stood, shouted, demanded explanations. Patricia tried to spin the narrative he claimed everything had been legitimate, but the room wasn't buying it. Then, from the middle of the chaos, someone yelled, "Where's our money, Patricia?" That's when she broke. "Fine," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Maybe I used some funds, but I've been working for this ungrateful community for years without pay. I deserve something back." The room fell silent. It was the confession everyone had been waiting for. And standing quietly in the back, Officer Rodriguez, whom Henry had discreetly invited for security, had heard every word. 2 weeks later, Patricia Walsh was formally charged with embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of community funds. She was convicted and sentenced to county jail. Jack? He was ordered to pay full restitution for the destruction of David's garden and sentenced to 200 hours of community service. The HOA board voted to immediately remove Patricia from office, and they elected Henry as interim president. His first act? Implementing full financial transparency policies and monthly budget disclosures. "I kept my land, and with the help of a few volunteers, I created a small memorial garden by the lake and David's Namia open to the community. A place for peace, not power plays." 6 months later, I received a letter from Patricia's attorney. Even from behind bars, she was still clawing for control. The letter threatened a civil lawsuit for defamation and intentional emotional distress. She was planning to appeal her conviction. I showed the letter to Henry. He read it, exhaled sharply through his nose, and said with a chuckle, "Some people never learn." And he was right. Never underestimate the quiet ones. We might just be the ones who expose your secrets. If watching Patricia get her long overdue karma made your day, hit that like button. Your support keeps stories like this alive. Subscribe to Ya Stories for more tales where bullies fall and justice rises. And remember, karma's never in a hurry, but it always shows up.